Hi everyone, welcome for today's webinar. I'm so sorry, I think Vishnu have some glitch over in Myanmar. That is why the streaming isn't very good over here. I'll just do a quick introduction. Today we have Dr. Chirag with us. Dr. Chirag is from ETH Zurich. He's a scientist and researcher. And our moderator today is Miss Surin Choi from DAARA. DAARA is a media company, industrial media company from South Korea. Without delay any further, Surin, I will pass this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone is keeping well. It has become following the last session, which was held last Friday. Today, we are here to share and connect online. The topic for today's webinar is energy savings and audit. This session, we have only one previous expert sharing his knowledge with us. After his sharing, we shall move to the Q&A at the end of the session. Here we have Dr. Chirag, today's expert. He is an architect from the National Institute of Technology, Trichy, India, Institute Gold Medal, and also graduated from the National University of Singapore in 2017. And also he is a well-known researcher and scientist in this field. During his presentation, please do type on the chat box and be ready to raise your button over in Zoom to ask your questions live, okay? Here, I would welcome Dr. Chirag.
Okay, thank you a lot, Suri, and the whole team for having me here. It's a good opportunity to share some of the work which I have been working on. And maybe I can start by sharing my screen first. So I hope everyone can see my screen. And I would basically like to do this presentation for about 30 minutes, and then we could have answers accordingly. So I welcome you all to this presentation from wherever you are joining. My name is Chirag Deb, and I'm from the Institute of Technology and Architecture in ETH Zurich in Switzerland. So before we proceed, I would mention that my presentation on this topic will be purely from a research perspective. Right? So I believe that in the past days, you have already attended some talks that focus on standard audit types and processes. And my take on this topic would be to share with you the latest trends in energy savings and audit research and how these would help us to enhance the entire audit process, right? So I've organized this presentation wherein we first look into the global energy situation and the significance of buildings in energy and emission, right? Then I would share with you some of the latest research and motivation on energy savings and energy audit. Then we go into something very interesting, which is called data-driven energy audits, right? This is kind of an outcome of the current research in energy audits. And finally, we look into case studies in which first I would present a case study from Singapore, and then we go to Switzerland, wherein I'll present a case study for a data-driven energy audit project there. Now, before we proceed into energy savings and audit, we must first look into what is the significance of energy savings in buildings in the current context, in the current global context, right? So you all must be aware already that buildings are the largest energy consuming sector in the world, and they consume around 35% of the global final energy use. They're also responsible for about 30%, 40% of the direct and indirect emissions. And the building related emissions, they continue to rise because of developing economies and the increase in construction rate. And also buildings have a very long life cycle. So if you design an inefficient building today, then it's just going to sit there and eat up your resources for a very long time. So it is very important that buildings are efficient. Right? Now the real issue, surprisingly, is not the high energy consumption, but it's actually the source from where the energy is coming from. So if you look at the sources, I have here like 3 developed economies. If you look at the United States, Germany, Singapore, you see that a very large portion of their energy source or energy supply is based on fossil fuels, right? A huge share of oil, coal, natural gas. For Singapore, huge share of oil, natural gas as well. And even if you see globally, this trend is kind of alarmingly increasing for the last decade. So this is the main motivation that why energy efficiency is very important, because unless we bring down these curves, there is absolutely no way to bring down climate change and reduce the global warming effect, right? So that's why the motivation is to do enhancement in this direction wherein we can reduce our energy consumption. Now, I also did a quick check on Myanmar, and it was very interesting to see that the major share of energy supply is from biofuels. And biofuels, of course, it is green compared to conventional fossil fuels, but I mean, you know better that it's still debatable, right? Another interesting aspect about energy consumption in Myanmar is particularly the electricity. And we see that the trend is kind of increasing for the last few years. And why I have kept my cursor here is because if you look at these levels, the National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Policy, they had set a target of reducing the national electricity demand by 12%. So by 2020, this point, it should have been here, right? By 2020 somewhere, but it is already here. Of course, this is energy consumption. This is not energy demand, but nonetheless, it is important to see this trend of increasing energy consumption, right? So what I'm doing now is trying to give you an idea of why energy efficiency is important, why the seriousness of doing an accurate and effective energy audit is quite important, not just from our own, like your company's point of view, but also from a national and a global point of view. Now, due to these reasons, in order to curb this rise in energy demand and consumption, many international bodies and research centers have come up with scenarios that aim to meet the reduction in energy demand and consumption. So for example, here are the 2 very famous scenarios. One is the International Energy Agency's Efficient World scenario, which demands that unless there is a 40% improvement in energy efficiency, then we are not going to achieve the United Nations targets of Sustainable Development Goals, right? The second is also this low energy demand scenario, which also says that a 1.5 degree reduction in global climate has to be supplemented by an enormous increase in energy efficiency. So many countries have taken this initiative to reduce their energy demand. For example, this is the Swiss Energy Strategy 2050. You can see it has 3 parts. The first is to reduce the nuclear power. So right now it forms around 33% of their energy source. They want to reduce it to 0 completely. I'm sorry about the background noise. It's a bit, the pets are quite anxious in this part of the world. And then you have, the second is the renewable energy sources. Switzerland, for example, they want to really increase their reliance on renewable energy sources. And the third, very interestingly, is they want to invest in energy efficiency. So these 3 are the 3 pillars of the Swiss Energy Strategy 2050. I'm just giving you an idea that every country has its own policies, and energy efficiency in buildings is more or less there in those pillars for most of the countries, right? Coming back to buildings, the importance of buildings and how to approach the problems of making buildings energy efficient. A very simple way to classify buildings is as new and old, right? So for new buildings, if you look at the current construction techniques and examples from recent times, it is much, much easier to make them energy efficient because we can work on the initial design and it's an empty paper to work with. So it's no problem. You can design the most effective orientation, spatial organization. You can use the best of the technologies. And then you have this perfect zero energy building, for example. On the left of the screen, you see the School of Design and Environment in the National University of Singapore. This is the first zero energy building as an institutional building in Singapore and also one of the first in the world. And then on the right, on top, you see a residential house. This is in Switzerland. This is also zero energy. This is in fact a positive energy building. And here you see that on the roof, you have these solar tiles. So they convert the solar radiation into useful electricity, and they also supply it back to the grid because it is quite surplus, right? On below here, this is an example from South Korea, where this house is designed in such a way that on the backside, if you see here, it's not shown, it's also solar photovoltaics. So you can, so the idea is that for new buildings, it is quite possible to target a set of energy consumption and then to achieve it. But for existing buildings, which is the majority of all the buildings on earth, right now. So looking at the existing buildings, it is not at all easy to rework on them. So if you translate all the existing buildings into this sphere, you see that this is the current energy retrofitting or energy auditing rate, right? So we have this whole bunch of quite inefficient building stock, and this is the current energy audit rate, because we'll later look into the energy audit process and how it is quite time consuming and quite linear. So it is not very easy to accelerate this process. We will just very quickly look into all the reasons. But just to give you an idea that the current retrofit rate or the current renovation rate using energy audits is very, very low, right? So this is where energy audits come handy. And there are many standards. Obviously, most of the countries have their own, but they are mostly focused on this ASHRAE standard. There is a bunch of them, right? So in Singapore, for example, they use what they call as the Singapore standard, ISO 50002. This is based on the, I think there is an extra zero here, never mind. This is based on the ISO standard 50002 and also a bit from the ASHRAE standard. But however, I mean, in terms of my experience with dealing with the energy service companies in Singapore, most of them, they actually base their energy audits on these standards. So this is quite important, quite good. Of course, we are not going into details. What is this? Because I think there are more, you already had such kind of a discussion, but this is the book to go with if you're going for an audit. But anyway, coming back to the research concept, I mean, these energy audits which which currently the world is based upon, they are all very, very linear, right? So it starts with, for example, data collection, then you have data analysis, then you try to compute the saving potential of energy in your building, in your facility, and then you go for a recommendation. And then there are, of course, different types of levels of audit, like level 1, 2, and 3, but more or less they're all based on this flow. So if you see that this is all very, very linear, right? So it's you can't actually jump from step to step. Of course, there are some people who say that this is kind of circular. You again go back from recommendations, you try to see that how this will affect your saving potential. But then in terms of the basic foundation, it is all very linear, right? What are the drawbacks? The drawbacks are that it takes quite some time, like 2 to 6 months easily for a large commercial building to do this audit. A lot of manpower, which in the developed world is not very cheap. So it leads to a very high cost of doing this energy audit. And this is one of the main drawbacks of which is the hindrance towards these energy audits, right? The cost is normally very, very high. Now, there's also accuracy, which is not so much talked about, but the building owners, many times they are aware of this performance gap. So the performance gap is basically the difference between how much you have the expected savings and the real savings. So if the building owner is not confident about your calculations, then he's not going to go with the energy audit. So the accuracy of the models and what you have done in your past projects is extremely important. So the accuracy is basically determined by the modeling techniques, by the analysis techniques you use. So the research question is that, can we accelerate this entire process, right? All this process, and at the same time reduce these 4 variables. So this is where the data-driven energy audit comes very handy. This is the first time now I'm mentioning this word in this presentation, data-driven energy audit, because there is a lot of research now which says that we can actually rely on energy data from buildings, from energy audit even published energy audit reports. We can learn through those reports. We can also go and do a very quick measurement, or we can use the already available data in a very quick way to come up with the retrofit strategies, right? Now for my PhD, this is what I had looked. I looked into a lot of research on energy audit. And then post 2012, there have been really a large number of studies that relate to automation of this energy audit process. Now, more or less, this entire new concept of data-driven energy audit, which uses data for auditing your building. Of course, you might be thinking that we already use data, but what I'm talking about is a different kind of data. We are talking about, number one, big data from several buildings, right? So in the current process, you go to an individual building, you do a very thorough energy audit, you spend 4 to 6 months, you spend a lot of money, and then you go to the next building. So what I'm saying is that many government bodies, they actually own these data sets. So can we do some kind of a common inference from all these energy audit reports which have been done, and then derive some common inferences or common solutions which can be applied to a new building which has to be audited, right? So that's what I mean with big data from several buildings. And of course, individual buildings, we can also look into enhancing or accelerating the audit time and effort, even in individual buildings. So we look into both of these examples in my presentation today. Now, some very basic research questions can we learn from several audit reports. As I just mentioned, can we also rank the variables? Because normally, since the audit process is very linear, we try to measure the same variables again and again for every building. Now, can we derive an understanding in which we know that, okay, I did an energy audit for, let's say, for 50 buildings, and now I know that some variables are actually redundant. I don't even need to measure them. So can we derive such kind of understanding? Can we automate data collection process? Because with the upcoming Internet of Things, all the devices are quite connected. There is a huge amount of data available in the cloud. Can we use such kind of data? Can we automate and live stream such data and use that for energy auditing, for increasing the efficiency of the building? And can we also automate the savings prediction? Can we also automate the analysis part? Not just the data collection, but also the analysis and the recommendations. So can we do these in an automated way so that we use less manpower, less cost, less time, right? So these two can be grouped into the big data side, and these two can be into the individual. Now I'll present like 2 case studies. The first is based on a group of buildings in Singapore, and the second would be in one canton of St. Gallen in Switzerland. So let's start with case study 1, in which we look into a group of buildings in Singapore, in which I had actually contacted the energy service companies there. Now this portion here, this is part of my PhD, and it is quite good to go back to my PhD and share these things with you. It's been quite a while. So there are like many ESCOs, energy service companies in Singapore, and you can actually obtain the name list from the Building and Construction Authority. So I had actually collaborated with 6 of them, these 6. And what I did, I went to them, I got the energy audit reports for office buildings, which were like 56 office buildings in Singapore, large office buildings. Right? And it took almost about 6 months just to get these reports, because it involved several visits to these ESCOs. And then I was able to obtain this data set of 56 office buildings with all the variables on their cooling side, on the metadata for the buildings, like the floor area, the ventilation rate, for example, the occupancy, the operating hours, and so forth. I got all this data, right, for these 56 buildings. And it also involved many non-disclosure agreements, because in Singapore, and then because of this reason, I do not discuss the names of these buildings at all. I just look into the buildings as IDs or numbers. Right? So just to give you a very quick snapshot of the energy use index of these buildings. If you're familiar with this term, the energy use index is the energy use per square meter per annum. So you can see that the buildings, they range right from a very small to very high energy consumption, and also in floor area. So you can see that the red bar is basically the, the floor area, and the blue bar is the energy consumption. Right? So obviously there is a relationship between the floor area and the energy consumption as in increase, and then this also increases. Now, a very preliminary analysis of the data set that I obtained, it shows that before the retrofit, before the energy audit, the EUI for these buildings, it was almost around like 240. Right? So this 241 could be broken into air conditioning and non-air conditioning, you can see here. And then after the energy audit was done and the savings measures were applied, there was a saving of almost around like 21% for the air conditioning side and around 11% on the non-air conditioning side. Right? So you can see that most of the energy savings is actually coming from the air conditioning side. Similarly, if you see some other variables, like this is just like the pre-retrofit, like before the energy audit, you have the different variables based for the chiller plant efficiency. This just shows the maximum, minimum, and the average chiller plant efficiency. And the light green here is the improved chiller plant efficiency after the energy audit. So you see that there's a significant improvement between what was before, I mean these three, max, minimum, and average, and what is later. So most of the energy audits, at least in Singapore, they targeted the chiller plant efficiency improvement. Either you replace it or you improve it. Now this part I'm not going to go too much details into, but I just want to show you the power of this data-driven energy audits. So once I have all these variables for the 56 buildings, I could plot and see that for all the buildings, where do these variables lie? So if I look at this, for example, the chill water temperature difference, I know that, of course, these are normalized values. I know that there's a huge range. So buildings, they operate very, very differently. So it's not the same. But when you're looking at one building, then you just have one point somewhere, and then you hardly know your context in terms of other buildings here. So the first approach, what I did was to cluster. Clustering is a statistical machine learning technique in which you can cluster the improvement in the energy use index. And then it was seen that there are actually 3 clusters. So some buildings which fall in this cluster, they had a huge improvement in their energy savings. The cluster 2 was kind of medium, and then there were some buildings which, even after an expensive energy audit, they did not achieve a significant energy saving. You can see that the worst building, what actually it could only do a little bit more than 5% of energy savings. So if you look at the variables which I had collected and try to correlate this in terms of excuse me, I'll be just back. Yeah. Sorry, my baby is not doing so well. Sorry for the interruption. So if you go back to this, to the variables, so we saw that the energy improvement can be classified into 3 clusters. And if you go back to these variables and see that how the different variables are distributed in terms of the improvement in energy saving, this kind of cluster plot can give you that what's the change of energy, percentage of energy, air energy consumption, what's the influence of that on the existing EUI? And again, what's the influence of the chiller plant average efficiency on the EUI existing, right? So you can actually, this is quite interactive, you know that some buildings which do have a very high energy savings, for example, the red cluster here, for them, you can actually go back and then look into these variables and see where do they lie. So this is one of the advantages. Right? And if you want to have a detailed look into all the methodology, you are very welcome to read the thesis and also the published papers. But finally, what was achieved was that we could find that there are actually, you can use these variables to actually predict how much energy savings you can expect in your buildings, right? So that was the most important thing. So what I'm trying to say is that if you give me these, let's say the 4 variables, which I found out to be most important, if you give these 4 variables to me, I can tell you roughly that how much energy savings you can expect for your building, even without doing this energy audit, based on the results of these 56 buildings. Right? So these clusters can give an indication of the expected energy saving values. Now to take a step forward to get the exact, how much would be the exact energy improvement we also looked into prediction models. And in this, we used artificial neural networks, which is the most popular machine learning technique. We use that to predict the energy savings for these buildings. And you can see that I was able to predict the energy savings quite close to the measured value. So this model was actually trained on these 56 buildings, and these are the results for that. So the model can actually predict very closely that how much savings a building should expect based on the input variables, right? What we measure. So I can also use this model for a new building, and I can then give a very precise, at least with a 75% accuracy, I can tell that this is what exactly your energy saving would be, even without doing the audit, but just get some basic data on, for example, area and efficiency, plant efficiency example. Now the cost of the audit is very, very important. So the data set which I had obtained, it could be classified into retrofit cost 1 and cost 2. The cost 1 is basically high cost, and the cost 2 is like low cost retrofit. You can see that if you increase, normally it is seen that if the building is quite large, then obviously the costs also increase. If it is a deep retrofit, like if you have to replace a chiller plant, for example. Right? So I also did some analysis on this. I'm not going into the details, but what was obtained is that a cost model. So it looks very simple, very neat here. What you can derive from here is basically shown in this box. So let's say if your existing chiller plant efficiency is of this order, right, and the retrofitting cost you can afford per square meter is up to $27, this is Singapore dollars, then you can expect an improvement in efficiency of your building by 8%. Right? And similarly, if you increase the cost, the efficiency improves. And obviously here the cost is same, but then the existing chiller plant efficiency differs. Therefore, you have different improvement potential. So I hope you're able to follow so far. This cost model can even now be used. And so this basically brings us to the end of case study 1. If you have some questions, I'm sure you do, then we could take it at the end of the presentation. But for now, we proceed to case study 2. This is particularly based on the canton of St. Gallen. You can see that the snapshot is quite different from that of Singapore. It's quite low rise and mostly residential, not very commercial here. So we looked into 8 different single family houses in this canton in St. Gallen. And what we did is that we developed a wireless sensor network to measure the different energy related and indoor environmental related variables for these buildings. So this is how they look. This sensor here, for example, you can see it blends variable with the indoors. This is actually measuring how much heat is being lost by the window, because it's a cold climate there. It's completely opposite to that of Southeast Asia. And the most important energy consumption is for space heating and domestic hot water. So it's very important to measure the heat loss from the envelope there, right? So the whole kit, which we had developed in ETH, it can be packed and can be transported very, very easily and deployed in building, right? So the normal energy audit process, what they do is that they visit these residential buildings. I go back quickly to these houses. And what they do normally is that they visit, and then they have these handheld instruments and quite complex wired instruments. And they also do a very visual kind of an inspection to see how much the building can be improved. But our approach is totally different. It is completely like non-intrusive. You just place these sensors and you come back. And then what you do, you try to get these data online. So once you have the sensors, they are like your hands and ears inside the building. You get all these very, very important and relevant variables. For example, air temperature, electricity, return temperature, supply temperature of the hot water, and so forth. Also heat flux, like heat losses from the windows and walls. And then you get this very high resolution 5-minute interval time series data. And what do we do with that? We can do a lot of things. Just to give you some example, we did a temporal analysis, and we found out that like this is some kind of a clock plot, which shows that for 56% of the time, the indoor temperature is between like 23 and 24, right? And when does this happen? This happens between 0 and 12 noon. So for 12 hours, this one of these houses, this is data from one of the houses. So for 12 hours, the house is maintained between 23 and 24. And for some period, like between 13, like 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., you see that the indoor air temperature is quite high, like more than 25. And just to give you an idea, to achieve a temperature more than 25 degrees in winter in Switzerland, you need an enormous amount of heat. So this kind of gives you an idea of where exactly, at what time of the day is the energy is maximally being used in this building. Right? Same for the CO2 concentration. You see that the CO2 is quite dependent on how many people are there inside the building. So if the CO2 is less, we know that people are not there here, right? So you see that between 1 p.m. and 6 p.m., the CO2 is very, very less. That means that there is nobody inside the house. And mind you that we assume that the windows are closed, because in winter they normally are closed in Switzerland. I mean, for most of the time, but you also open it for ventilation here and there, but we assume that it is closed here in this case. So you see that between 1 p.m. and 6 p.m., there is hardly anyone in your house. But what is happening? You are heating the house to the maximum extent. So just by this simple analysis from these measurements, I can automatically tell you that between 1 p.m. and 6 p.m., please shut down your heating system, or at least reduce it, because you are not there and then you're wasting a lot of energy. So this is some kind of a very like low-hanging fruits, in a very very easy and quick way. You can tell them what to do without even going through all that Excel calculations and so forth. Right? We also used the data to disaggregate that where exactly the energy is going. This is also completely using data mining methods. We saw that most of the energy is actually going for space heating, right? And then a little bit on appliances heating. So you see that by data mining, we can also reduce our number of sensors. Just with one final electricity consumption, we are able to break it into where the energy is being used. So now I know that for this building, I need to target heating, space heating, because 86% of this energy is going into space heating. So these kind of plots are extremely important and very user-friendly, like customer-friendly. You can show it to the house owners. And I mean, we have experience for these 8 houses. The house owners are extremely happy, because without much effort, without even going into the building, we can have these plots and we can communicate with them. And then this is the first level of their interest that they would like to go for the next level of audit, right? So this is what are one of the like advantages of such a process. Then obviously it's not enough, because energy auditing, and then there's also this step of retrofit or the energy conservation measure proposal, right? So for that proposal, we do this energy modeling. Again, our goal is to make this process, this modeling, as automated as possible. So we have 2 streams. One is the resistance, capacitance, or the RC models, in which we look at the building as a whole, as one box. And then the second is machine learning models, in which we use the inputs from our sensors as the variables, and then we predict the energy consumption in the building, right? So once we have a very defined model, we can change these inputs. So we can change, let's say, what would happen if you change the window system? We can get the effect on its output. What would happen if you change the set point of the windows? You can get the influence on the output. What would happen if you use the building less, the operation hours? We can again get the output, the influence in the output. So these kind of models are extremely crucial, extremely important. And mind you, these are all based on measured data. So these are not based on any assumptions. These are all data-driven modeling. That's why we call them data-driven audits, because they give a very accurate representation of what is happening in the building. We are not assuming anything here. It's all based on measurements, and we try to fit a model. So if you look for one of the buildings, we fitted these models, and we can come up with a table like that, because since it is a model, you can play around, you can change whatever you want in terms of the measures. So on the left, on these rows, you have the retrofit measures on the facade, on the envelope side, and as the columns, you have the change in the heating system type. So if you do a very quick matrix analysis, you see that the most effective solution in terms of the cost, the reduced cost in terms of the energy savings, is basically to retrofit the roof and the cellar ceiling with a certain material, which I have not mentioned here because it would be too much information. So it's to replace the roof and the cellar ceiling and to use a geothermal heat pump. So if you do that in your house, then you can expect this is the price per square meter per annum, which is actually quite low. So this is definitely a very good strategy for you to retrofit if you want. You can also look into the greenhouse gas emissions, the CO2 emissions. So obviously you can see that different heating systems, they have a very high influence on the greenhouse emissions. So if it's, for example, heat pumps, my apologies, I did not mention that heat pumps are very, very popular heating systems currently in Europe, and they are based on electricity. So they do not depend on oil or natural gas or biofuels. You can just plug it in, and depending on the mix of the energy supplied, they are considered very clean, as clean source of energy. So there are different types of heat pump. The geothermal is the most most effective, although it is quite expensive because it requires drilling boreholes into the ground. So this is kind of a summary for like the case study 2, and I hope you were with me so far. So I can basically conclude that, of course, depending, I mean, I have already emphasized in the starting part of my presentation that we need to enhance the energy auditing process, and this could be done by leveraging on existing data, obviously. And the third point is that the policymakers, I think they should also promote this kind of data sharing, so that there is a lot of transparency between these energy audit firms and between the buildings. Of course, it is not very easy, but this is what is required, because once all the buildings are connected and we are informed about what is happening in every building, then it is much easy to bring out that knowledge and apply it to a new building. So that's the main motivation for that. And then data-driven methods are very promising way forward because they are quite fast, they're very accurate, they also minimize human intervention. So we can really accelerate the energy audit process in this way. So that's it. I tried to make it quite concise without going into the details. And thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have, of course, we can do the discussion now. And if you also have something later, you can write to me. And for all the references, please visit sciencedirect.com, and there you can just type in my name. You will get all the references which I have used for this presentation, including my PhD thesis. So thanks a lot, and back to you, Suri.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chirag. It was awesome. Now we are moving to the Q&A. If you have any questions, you can pop up 1 or 2 depending on the request. And we already got some questions through the Facebook. So let me check. The first question is, hi, Dr. Chirag, what do you recommend for fertilizer factory? We run our operation for 24 hours. If we adopt this energy savings audit by a third party, how long will we start to see our return of investment? From Mr. Ma Wang.
Okay, can you repeat what kind of facility is that? Is it what kind of?
It's like, he said, you, what do you recommend for fertilizer factory?
Which factory?
Fertilizer factory.
A fertilizer factory.
Yes, yes.
Ah, fertilizer factory. Well, what I have shown was basically for office buildings and residences. So each building type has its own set of recommendations and processes. So a fertilizer factory, I'm not sure if it has to be operated 24 hours a day. If it is, then it is quite challenging to save energy on the operation side, but then you have to basically categorize your energy usage in terms of where the energy is going into, right? So one of the first steps in energy audit is to find out where the energy is being used. And once you know, once you're aware that where the energy is being used, you have to tackle these different sectors one by one. So let's say most of the energy is going for your manufacturing, right, of this fertilizer or some kind of a process. Then you have to see that whether this energy is enough or not. On the other hand, you see that most of the energy is actually going into just maintaining the building, maintaining the facility, and actually you don't need it. So this would be done by a professional energy auditor, for example. But as a rough check for you, you can just try to, I would say, categorize and classify the energy usage in your building, and then look about it.
Okay, he also asked about the period. How long will he start to see his return of investment?
That completely depends. So that completely depends on what kind of investment you do. So if you do a very high investment on the processes, then obviously the return of, the return of investment would depend on how much improvement can be obtained by the steps. Right? So normally it is, if there is a very high investment, the return of period, I don't know for fertilizer, but for a normal office building, it is around 5 to 6 years, depending on what you change. Right? It can also be very less. Yeah, yeah. So it is very dependent. This question is dependent on what you do, obviously.
Okay, let's move on to the second question. Will we have our return of investment if we combine this improvement together with the usage of generator? We always have power trip in Myanmar. We want to save more because electricity is very expensive. It's from Miss Yu.
So do you mean that the electricity is very expensive in Myanmar?
Yes, so her question is, will we have our return of investment if we combine this improvement together with the usage of generator? Do you think she's gonna be combined this improvement together with the usage of generator?
Yeah, that's a bit tricky because, well, I do not have any personal experience of this combining with generator, but at least from my experience, I can say that these two are, different things. Right? Normally, when you do energy audit model, you do not consider these like supplementary energy sources like generator or inverter. You actually look at the building as a whole. But when you have this generator, then most likely this will not be included in your return of investment calculation. And this is very important. I think depending on how the electricity supply in Myanmar is, this I think is very, very important. This is a very nice question because this is very, very important because if you retrofit, if you make the building very efficient, but you have to rely on generator, then what's the use? So yeah.
Okay, got it. Thank you for the answer. And the third question is from Mr. Kikimit. Will we have our, sorry. Oh, this is the same questions with the previous one. Okay, let's move on to the third one. It's from Mr. Indra. Is it a wise choice to use solar power system for long-term electricity savings? We have a plastic recycling factory. Our usage is heavy and we have a transformer in the factory.
Well, solar power, I hope that you mean photovoltaics, right? Like the photovoltaic solar power. If you mean that, then it is, there is not an absolute yes to that because solar power depends a lot on seasonality, right? So it is dependent on seasons, and therefore solar power often comes along with a storage capacity, right? So you also have to take care of the storage. So what normally people do is that they use solar panels to generate electricity and then feed it back to the grid and then take energy back from the grid when it is required, right? Okay. So you have to see in that perspective, never be completely dependent that if I use solar, then my whole energy consumption is based on this solar, right? So you obviously have to have some connection with the grid always, even if it is 100% solar. And it also depends if your, I don't know what kind of a building is that, but if your building requires high temperature heating for some processes, then solar is definitely not for that. Solar is basically for, let's say, for low-end energy users like lighting and fans and like computers and charging and stuff like that. But for high temperature heating and cooling, we do not use solar.
Okay, thank you for
unless
that.
it is a huge, yeah.
So I hope it would be the perfect answer for him. It would be the last question. It's from Mr. Zhao. We have two factories side by side. In your opinion, can we audit one building first and the other building later, but both buildings share one electric meter? Can we still see savings?
Well, I would say you can still do that, but why not install a second meter? I mean, just from your electricity, then it goes to, I don't know if it is, that's quite tricky. Yeah?
So you recommended installing the second meter?
Yeah, why not? I mean, if it is possible, then if two buildings are separate and the electricity lines are separate, then why don't you install like, or just measure the electric current, how much goes into your building.
But right? In this case, you still see the savings?
You still see the savings. And I think the challenge is not, I mean, the challenge would be that how do you measure how much saving you would have? Because if you have one electricity meter, then you do not know where the electricity is going basically in the two buildings. I think that's the challenge. So for that, if the buildings are very similar, then you can have some kind of idea that if I retrofit one building and maybe the energy consumption is maybe, I don't know, if the occupancy is 50-50, then it is also 50-50. If the occupancy is a different ratio, then something can be done. Of course, it is not, the most accurate would be that if you can measure exactly how much energy is going into one building, right? And not have a common meter. That would be most accurate. No confusion at all. Yeah.
Okay. I think about the Q&A session, that's it. So I would like to thank everyone and for this fruit sharing today. I also learned something new and would like to explore further with the experts in this session. I'm passing this webinar to Vizu. Thank you, Dr. Chirag.
Thanks.
Thank you, Surin. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Chirag, for your information. It was a very great information, and also for answering all the questions. And I hope everyone enjoying for this event. So if you have any feedback, please feel free to reach to us. You can send a message from our Facebook page or also to our email. So I hope you guys enjoy this event. We'll meet in next week, Friday, 5th of June. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. And yeah, see you later.
Aku di bonoကျွန်တော်ဒေါက်တာ Chirag share သွားတဲ့ information လေးတွေကိုလည်းသုံးဝင်မဲ့ထင်ပါတယ်။ကဲလို့မေးစရာရှိတဲ့မေးခွန်းတွေဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ Facebook page တို့ကျွန်တော် email တို့ကနေပြီးတော့ဆက်သွယ်မေးမြန်းနိုင်ပါတယ်။ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့အကောင်းဆုံးအတိုင်းဆုံးဖြေကြားသွားမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ပေါ့နော်။အားလုံးကောင်းဆုံးနေ့လေးဖြစ်ပါစေ။ကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်ဗျ။ Thank you guys. Take care.